All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Our Story of Atlantis, written down for the Hermetic Brotherhood and the Future Rulers of America by W.P. Phelan, M.D., together with an introduction, biography, prologue, notes, and epilogue by R. Swinburne Clymer, M.D., published by the Philosophical Publishing Company of Quakertown, Pennsylvania, 1937. Introduction. Until a comparatively short time ago, Atlantis, the sunken isle, was little more than a legend, the theme for fascinating stories. These stories, however, served a worthy purpose. They aroused interest in the minds of ethnologists and archaeologists, and a desire to investigate, to lay bare the hidden, and reconstruct for modern students that which was said to have been the ideal state. Among the greatest of these sincere and painstaking investigators is Professor Lewis Spence of Edinburgh, Scotland. In both his books, The Problems of Atlantis and The History of Atlantis, he accepts the traditions of the past, the legends of occult writers, and seeks to prove with evidence gathered by himself that all and even more than has been written of Atlantis is true. It is impossible to give a full resume of Professor Spence's discoveries and conclusions in the short space allotted for us for this purpose, but we will endeavor to quote sufficient to show that in the main, Dr. Phelan had a sound basis for the physical part of his story. Not only did the Isle of Atlantis exist, but it was also the source of all civilization even as we know it today, and during the existence of Atlantis, men developed themselves the arts and sciences to a degree unknown even today. Forces barely guessed at by our material and physical scientists of today were fully understood, harnessed, and directed by the Atlanteans, so that the tasks of life became pleasures. Atlantis was destroyed by a combination of volcanoes, earthquakes, and tidal waves, and sank beneath the ocean, and because it sank beneath the waves of the Atlantic, it is commonly known as Atlantis. It was the destruction of Atlantis that gave the basis for the biblical flood of the deluge. More than this, the story of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues originated in Atlantis. It was the Atlanteans who first conceived the idea of existence after death, the judgment of souls, and who gave Egypt its greatest god, Osiris, the light giver, and the Book of the Dead as well, oldest of all religious treatises, wherein are found full instructions for the conduct of the soul after death when it enters the hidden world. And this is the same as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, and it's really the secret knowledge that the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons today have, this idea of transcending the death of the physical body, taking on a light body, and going into various different dimensions. It was Atlanteans who brought civilization to Europe, and Atlanteans who established the culture of Central and South America, which the Spaniards Cortez and Pizarro destroyed. The earliest historic mention of Atlantis is in the dialogue of the Greek Plato, who recites that Solon, one of the wise men of the Greeks, was told the story of the far country by priests of the goddess Neith at Sais in Egypt, and was shown by them documentary evidence of the truth of the legend. Atlantis, they have been taught, was greater than North America and Asia Minor put together. It was in the path of other islands, and through which islands one would pass in reaching the opposite continents which surrounded the true ocean, which was America, then undiscovered but known to legend. And again, that goes right in line with my research into the rockwall, and also with the stuff that Sir Francis Bacon talked about in his book, The New Atlantis, how America was the new Atlantis that would be built on the ashes of old, and that we would have to face at some point the same sort of conundrum that the Atlanteans of old faced, which was, were we going to seek power for the sake of more power, or were we going to use the power that we already have to bring about a better world for everyone all over the planet. And that decision would ultimately decide our fate. And I guess it's not hard for us to tell where the hell we're going now, is it? The Atlanteans had full knowledge of all metals, even the process of hardening copper as we do steel today. They had an abundance of timber and were much further advanced in agriculture than we are at this time. They were the most skillful of all seamen, trading with all of the then known nations. They built their houses of stone, harmonizing white, black, and red. That sounds like the rock wall, doesn't it? Harmonizing all those different types of materials together. The walls of their cities were faceted with brass, tin, and a metal called orichalcum. I hate to bring up this Rockwall thing every time, but man, I tell you, I held a copper ring in my hand that was found within the rock wall. I held this thing. I touched it. And when analysis was done on this, it was made of brass, tin, and copper. All three of which they mentioned right here. It was a smelted material, and it was smelted somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 plus years ago. And these were found within the rock wall, and they looked like power outlets, like we see, like wall wart power outlets that we see today that we have in our homes. That's what it looked like. Every time we get into this, anything on Atlantis, it just reconfirms all of the research and stuff that we found on the rock wall. And of course, it fitting in with that timeline, the dating, all the dating that has been conducted on the rock wall is shown to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 220,000 years. And that matches up to the timelines in the Sumerian king list that described the 432,000 year time cycle in which these gods were building cities, basically the Atlanteans all over the planet, and they started erecting them somewhere in the 200,000 year time frame of that 432,000 year pre-flood timeline. The walls of their cities were faceted with brass, tin, and a metal called orichalcum. That just blows my mind to read that. I don't think it's hard to see what we're dealing with, especially when we look at the soil analysis, too, on the rock wall. And it shows conclusively, the soil analysis shows beyond any shadow of a doubt that the rock wall was covered in a catastrophic event somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 13,000 years ago. Exactly when the flood that supposedly destroyed Atlantis was said to have happened. Now, this is why they want to keep this thing covered up, folks. They do not want people to figure out that, yes, this is the new Atlantis. Because if you acknowledge that the old Atlantis was real, and you start to read Sir Francis Bacon, the guy who brought secret societies to the United States, you do realize that, right? Sir Francis Bacon is the guy that set up the whole secret society network in colleges, the Rosicrucians and Freemasons in the United States of America. Some people believe and I'm one of them that believe that he was actually William Shakespeare as well. But finding out and admitting and having proof, and this is why they're so scared of the rock wall, having absolute proof of the Atlantean civilization would then alert the rest of the planet. Just like Sir Francis Bacon talked about that, we are basically destined and written to go the same way that they went. See, that's why people can't wrap their minds around why the elite of the world today do what they do. Why would they poison the air? Why would they poison the water? Why would they poison the food? Why would they choose power for the sake of more power over using the power that we do have to make it a better world? Because, and I've said this many times on my radio show and whatnot, that at every turn it seems like they are trying to make some kind of prophecy or something that was written down long ago come to fruition, come true. And that seems like that's why they do what they do. And I think that's the case. I think for whatever reason, They believe it is their purpose to make America rise like the Atlantis of old and then fall just like it did. Now, to what end and for what purpose or what reason? I mean, we could speculate and argue about that all day long, but the fact remains, it becomes harder and harder to see that doesn't seem to be a reality. But if you have proof and you have evidence of the Atlantean civilization, like we do with the rockwall, and that gets out, and then the people of the world figure out, wait a minute, we don't want to go the way the Atlanteans of old went. If this is the new Atlantis built on the ashes of the Atlantis of old, which it indeed is, we don't want to go that way. We want to do the opposite of what they did. We want to achieve greatness and then use that to unify the world. And that would galvanize the people of the world. Absolute proof would galvanize the people, folks. This is why I put my life into this rockwall thing. God, it's just every time we get into this reading this, and that's why I love doing these readings for you, because they're always just such a reaffirmation of a lot of things that we already know and have already discussed and found to be true. The walls of their cities were faced with brass tin and a metal called orichalcum, which is said to have emitted a red light. The gods destroyed them and their land in a series of cataclysms, ending about 9600 BC. The great continent occupied the whole or major part of the North American region and a great portion of its southern basin. In the Miocene age, possibly 500,000 years ago, it still retained its continental character. But toward the end of that period, it began to disintegrate. Now, see here, they're saying, he says, about 500,000 years ago. And of course, the Sumerian king list describes this being 432,000 years ago, very explicitly. So 432,000 is very close to 500,000. Now understand, this book is an internal, secret society book, basically their archive on Atlantis. I mean, this thing inside of it, I paid a lot for this book. It's not really a rare book like the Atlantis and the Giants book that we read. That's very rare. You can't really find that anywhere unless you want to pay out the nose. This book you can actually get in PDF form. So if you want to read this yourself or read along with me, you can find that pretty readily. But what makes this version I have here in front of me, this is a hard copy version that I got some years ago. And I think I paid more for this book than I've ever paid for any book. But when it came to me, I realized why. Because it's got inside of it here, in the front of the page before the introduction that I just started reading, it's got a stamped seal that says "One for all and all for one." The HB of A, L, and E, Circle of Isis. And then it's got a winged disc that kind of looks like a swastika, but not a canted turned swastika like the Nazis used. It's basically a sun symbol. It's got the disc in the middle, then it's got 4 wings instead of 2 like you normally see in the Egyptian stuff. And then around that, it's got the Ouroboros, snake biting its tail. And it says, hereby declares R.S. Kleiman to be a brother attached to Knot, and then K-N-O-T, and then that's scratched out. Instead of attached Knot, it says to be a brother member in bounds, located at blank, 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 headquarters, San Francisco, California, W.P. Phelan, M.D., this 5th day of the 6th month, at 59:05 a.m. And this is all handwritten. I mean, this was like, I think I paid $100 for this book some years ago. But I think this was maybe even the author's own, I got it off Amazon, used. I think this may have even been the guy who wrote this book's own copy, because this is all, this is a seal for, I've never even heard of this, the H and B of A, L, and E. the Circle of Isis. I mean, I've been researching secret societies for 20-something years. I've never heard of that till seeing this. I mean, it just seems a bit strange, doesn't it? But anyway, yeah, that's that's what this is. This is essentially their internal annals and documentation that they have on Atlantis. And if you go into any of these Masonic temples and whatnot, like I have, you'll see that they're very obsessed with Atlantis, and they have Atlantis iconography in there as well.